I'm Captain Benjamin Sisko.
So, you're the commander of Deep Space Nine, and the emissary to the prophets, decorated combat officer, widower, father, mentor, and oh yes, the man who started the war with the Dominion. So I thought you'd be taller.
Sorry to disappoint you.
Welcome, everybody, to Positively Trek. I'm one of your hosts, Dan Gunther, and with me, as always, is the amazing and brightly lit Barry DeFord at the moment. Barry, how's it going?
Good. I wish I could polarize my window in my office right now. I'm thinking of 2009 Trek, when he's like, the one captain's like, polarize the view screen because it's just super bright, and I just lean back and I'm like, I can't see. So I'm going to be leaning in like I'm telling you all of my secrets quietly throughout this entire time. So to be very, I guess you could say Dr. Fraser Craney, I'm listening to you, Dan. How are you doing?
Well, I'm good. I just want to say I love when you lean back. It's like you're either caught in the throes of a J.J. Abrams lens flare or the glory of the Celestial Temple. I can't quite tell which, but
I'll take the Celestial Temple today. I'm feeling.
I think so.
I'm feeling it, given the situation that we're about to be getting ourselves into.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's definitely fitting because, as regular listeners will know, we've been kind of doing this thing where we talk about a character and we kind of break them down and discuss what they mean in the world of Star Trek and in relation to real life and all that sort of stuff. We've done James T. Kirk. We've done 2 episodes on Data because we felt that he required a little bit more coverage. And, TOS, TNG, feels like we should probably do a DS9 character next. And what better DS9 character to tackle than the emissary himself, Benjamin Lafayette Sisko.
Yeah, just keeping it light.
Yeah, exactly. Not just one of those fly-by-night characters, not a lot to talk about, no real depth. Obviously kidding. Obviously kidding. There's so much to talk about with this guy.
Yeah, he's Benjamin Sisko for me really does do every single thing that a character in a TV show should do. And I will say one of them has a lot to do with Avery Brooks stepping away from the role permanently. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before that, sometimes we get actors coming back, and honestly, 100%, I'm super happy to see them all, right? It is great. I'm glad they're getting work. I'm glad that they get a chance to retread old characters and stuff like that. And I can't necessarily speak to why, and I can't speak to what his motives are or anything, but Avery Brooks has quite doggedly said no thanks to retreading Benjamin Sisko. And I do feel very good in a lot of ways that his story is sort of closed. Now, that doesn't mean we can't see him in other iterations of Star Trek portrayed by other actors, but all I'm going to say is if they do, they had better step up, because in my most humble opinion, Benjamin Sisko is the best character in Star Trek, and possibly, for me, in television altogether. He is very much up there. Wow. I think that Avery Brooks, literally, you can see Avery Brooks's turmoil and a lot of what makes him such a good actor. So many aspects of him are so well developed and well put together. And there's good parts, there's injustices, there's different sides to him. There's things that I don't like about Sisko too. But I think it's just the fact that I think of all of the characters, I probably have spent the most time truly thinking a lot about Benjamin Sisko. So if you're not a big fan of Barry going off on stuff, this isn't the episode for you, but understand that this is very much comes out of a deep love for the character and a deep reverence for what Star Trek tried to do in that time. And I really appreciate how they approach this character.
I absolutely 100% agree. And I love the high praise, one of the best characters on television. And I find myself really hard pressed to disagree. I was going to come in strong with my, back in the day, everyone was going Kirk or Picard, and then Deep Space Nine came along, and a couple seasons in, I was like, Sisko's my, well, at the time commander, but captain, once they finally did his character justice and made him a captain. But yeah, I can't compete with your high praise. That's amazing. I love how much this character means to me, you, and so many people out there as well. As a little side tangent, and we'll talk a little bit more about the cultural impact and stuff later, as to the extent to which we're qualified to, which is not very. I've been recently seeing posts where people are talking like kind of this backlash to what they're calling Star Trek wokeism, which blows my mind. Like, first of all, yeah, huge eye roll at that. But saying, back in the day, there was no pushback against, characters of color because it was just blah, blah, blah. It wasn't, made a big deal of. That is huge historical revisionism, because I absolutely remember, and keep in mind, this is, early days of internet and before the internet. And I still was able to pick up, the backlash against, oh my goodness, the captain of color kind of thing. And heaven forbid, even once the fandom started to accept him, or those, or it was less blatant that people were saying it. Heaven forbid the character mention racism in the show. I remember that happening in, season 7, notably with the episode Bada Bing Bada Bang, and I remember people at that time saying like, that is the worst thing, blah, blah, just showing why Star Trek did need to tackle that, because my God, the blind spots in our fandom sometimes.
Absolutely. I echo every single word you've said. And for people to create that kind of, you're right, the revisionism, it's not wokeism that we're dealing with. It's people who want to cling to these sort of quaint notions of color blindness and everything. And, there are some episodes we're going to talk about specifically. There are some interactions that Sisko has, and there are some points that Avery Brooks himself makes through the character and through his time in interviews around that character that, no, 100%. They approached a lot of that, the white supremacy that exists inside of Western culture. Now, did they do it perfectly and with, zest and vigor each time? No, actually, I think it comes a lot through the mistakes and some of the blind spots, like you said, in that time. And so I think we can probably just get started, because you've got some listing pieces here that we're going to lead the conversation through. And I think the very first one, we can dive right into this. So I'm so excited to talk about Ben Sisko. This is great.
Yeah, me too. Well, let's start at the beginning, which, as I'm told, is a very good place to start. The very start of Deep Space Nine, and I've kind of got things laid out linearly here. We can jump around as we need, but Sisko at the start of Deep Space Nine was such an interesting character, and one that I think might have flown under the radar for a lot of people. First of all, we have the lead of the show, not a captain, but a commander. And yeah, we'll talk a bit about that. The other thing is the depth of what they wrote for him to start with. Like, we've talked about this before, but it feels like all of the leads of the previous shows, of which, of course, there were only 2, but they were blank slates at the start. They were the captain and they had their crew. Let's get started and see what's happening. Sisko, at the beginning, we start with this flashback to this formative event in his life, this nexus event that has set the course of his life for the next few years. This tragedy where he loses his wife, loses his most of what he's familiar with his life at the Battle of Wolf 359. He's embittered. He's broken. He doesn't want to be where Starfleet is sending him. And I mean, even just starting with that, he has pages more backstory than any other character in Star Trek ever had up to this point at the start of the show. Some interesting choices as well. We have Picard, who's a beloved character, has been captain of the Enterprise for 5+ years at this point. We're in the middle of TNG season 6 when Deep Space Nine starts. And one of the first things we see Sisko do in the present time period is kind of get in his face and express how much he hates this man because of what he represents, him being Locutus of Borg, taken his life away from him. What a brave choice, honestly, for the writers of this show to take a character that the fandom loves and have this new lead character get in his face and just like hate him.
Yeah.
I kind of like watching it back now. I can't believe they did that.
It's in bold move, I would say. And I think that sets the tenor for the entire series, where the point of Deep Space Nine in so many ways was to take and I use this very intentionally, a revolutionary approach to Star Trek, where I think in a lot of cases in our own history, we tend to lionize the wrong people in a lot of ways. So, for instance, just to kind of use an example, in India, there isn't a lot of love for Winston Churchill, whereas where I grew up in Edmonton, we have Churchill Square. And I remember my grandma saying like, oh, we used to listen to the radio and we'll fight them in the beaches and all this sort of stuff, right? Well, when Greece was being liberated from the Nazis, there were famine conditions starting. And the Allies realized that they didn't want to take over a country that was suddenly going to be thrust into a famine thanks to the war. And so Winston Churchill and John Maynard Keynes, the guy who came up with Keynesian economics with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, planned out how they were going to move a bunch of grain and wheat and supplies from Bengal in India all the way to Greece to prevent this famine, which then caused a famine in Bengal. And Winston Churchill's response to the concept of him engineering a famine in India was, famine or no famine, Indians will breed like rabbits. I think to myself, that takes him in such a different point. Now, Picard gets the pass because he was, like his brain was under control of the Borg and all this sort of stuff. But to mirror that in certain ways, no, we sometimes need that rattling of our cage as a society to reckon with some of the more important aspects of people who we just sort of think of as, oh, well, they're just a hero and doop, doop, doop. We can just talk to anyone around the world and they'll say, yep, he was a great guy or she was a great person, this, that, and the other thing. And so I think that irreverence that Deep Space Nine brings through the character of Sisko and draws that line through it. And I mean, we see that irreverence in other characters as well in Deep Space Nine, but immediately and initially giving him that level of irreverence and a very fresh and challenging take is what brought me into the series immediately. Now, I watched syndication. I didn't actually watch the initial run. I think I would have started watching it when they were finishing up season 5. So I wound up having to kind of catch the episodes as they were showing up on like Space or whatever TV channel they had the older episodes on. And so I can't necessarily say Emissary was my first episode, but when I watched it, it really did bring me into the series like no other way. I think it is probably the strongest opening episode of any series as well.
Absolutely agree.
That goes up to today. And yeah, his anger and his frustration and his reluctance, and yeah, like you said, a very clear and concise backstory. And to add on to all of that, the writers and the producers and the studio and whoever was making this plan didn't see fit to make a black man a captain immediately. Mm-hmm. I honestly think we can't unsee that. And I think, once again, for better or for worse, that is a lesson that I think Star Trek as a franchise had to learn. And it's important to understand that. Now, they treat it differently with Michael Burnham, but they did it again. She isn't a captain right off the bat. And, to some degree, they explain it out, and I agree with their explanation. But this ultimately, and maybe some of you might be screaming at me saying, well, there was other black captains, all the way back, and, this, that, and the other thing, TNG had black captains. Like, what are you talking about? There's black captains in the TOS movie franchise, yada, yada, yada. As main characters, we have never seen a black captain just appear immediately. They have to become a captain later. They have to fight tooth and nail for it. And I think that there is something there that we can't unsee. Now, again, Dan and I are both gentlemen who aren't black, but as we've said, so from our limited standpoint, this is something that we also recognize and think needs to be part of the discussion when we talk about Sisko.
Absolutely. And I've seen this brought up too with the writers of Deep Space Nine, and I'm pretty sure it was Ira Stephen Bear who said maybe not the initial introduction of the character, but later in the series, talking about how he thinks Sisko should have been an admiral at some point. And we'll get to where I think that should maybe have happened in the series and would have been kind of interesting. I think of all the characters, that character deserves that position and basically kind of has that position later in the series in everything but rank. As far as I'm given to understand, as far as I remember, that, you know, they kind of were thinking of wanting to do that, but the powers that be above them were saying, like, and this is feeding into that whole thing again, they did not want Sisko to outrank Picard and Janeway. And I wonder why that would be. I'm not going to ascribe anything here more than just asking that question. So, yeah.
and once you lift these rocks, right, the bugs you find are interesting. And the fact that this really is a prescient topic immediately into our discussion that, you know, obviously is coming from love, right? Like this is a wonderful, well put together character, and I've said a lot of really important things about him. But it is also because of these injustices, it is because of these bonk bonk on the head, as they would say in other Star Trek podcasts, issues in the real world that continuously come up over and over and over again. So yeah, I think just sort of kind of delving a little bit further, I always think of that exchange between Sisko and Picard on the Enterprise there, and their conversation with one another.
It's been a long time, Captain. We met before. Yes, sir. We met in battle. I was on the Saratoga at Wolf 359.
And even Picard himself is a little, not disarmed, but you can tell he's really having to reckon with the attitude of this officer who is very much like, I don't care who you are. I don't care who you think you are now. You ruined my life. And because of that, I choose not to forgive you right now, and I don't have to forgive you. And I think to some degree in our society, we always think of the non-violent and the, you know, oh, just turn the other cheek and all these sorts of things. And those are values that I think are important in certain contexts and in certain times. But if I, as a, you know, white man walks into a community of non-white people and I'm immediately distrusted or I'm immediately kind of kept at arm's length, for me to become immediately taken aback and shocked, and, you know, I clutch my chest and, oh, how could they treat me this way? I'm not blah, blah, blah. I think much like Picard isn't Locutus anymore, but he still represents Locutus. He still is to some degree Locutus, whether he likes it or not. That is a history that he holds and continues to have and will continue to have for as long as he lives. And because of that, he has to own that part of his history. And if I think about us as, you know, myself as a settler, someone whose ancestors really benefited from moving to Canada, I can't ignore the fact that in my wife's family, those are the people who lost so that my people could win. And reckoning with that, I think, is an important thing that doesn't make me a bad person or anything like that, but it does shape the relationship, and it calls me to a certain standard. And it's something that I think in time it kind of sort of washes out. Like, I don't really see a full forgiving or any kind of moment where, you know, Sisko and Picard really and truly come to terms with each other. At least I'm not remembering any episodes where that truly happens. And I think that's important because sometimes these things need to be left. Sometimes these things are going to be imperfect and they're not going to go your way. And that's an important piece to really good storytelling is, yeah, this is a loose end, and it's a loose end that you're just going to have to be okay with.
No, absolutely. That's all great points. There's just a couple other things I want to talk about with Sisko in, you know, the pilot and season 1 of Deep Space Nine. So first of all, it strikes me that this complication of Sisko's backstory and the fact that, like, you know, he's at odds with Picard is introducing this element that's going to pervade Deep Space Nine as a whole. This, you know, blemish or this smudge on the utopia of Star Trek, right? Like Deep Space Nine, I think, really pushed that, and it starts right here. It's baked in, and it's something that I think once you've seen the series and go back, it's very apparent. But at the time, he kind of didn't realize the wheels within wheels of what they were doing here. And I love that, like, you know, we've got a first officer who was, in the eyes of a lot of people, including many in the Federation, a terrorist. And in the eyes of her and her people, of course, a freedom fighter. There's these perspectives. You get a different perspective on Picard than you would have elsewise. And that just pervades the series. The other thing I want to say about Sisko is the fact that he doesn't want to be there. And he says that to Picard. Do you ever get that impression when he's dealing with his crew? No, he is the consummate professional. When he steps on there, he goes to Kira. And I love that their first interaction, where the first thing Kira says to her is, I suppose you're going to want the office. And he says, I thought I'd say hello first, and then I'll take the office. But we can do it in whatever order you like. You know, he doesn't realize it. He doesn't think so, but he's the perfect person for this assignment. He thinks he's only going to be there for a few weeks while Starfleet finds a replacement, but he still recognizes the fact that, hey, we need a community leader. We need people like Quark to step up and say that they're staying. He's a builder, right? He's building this community even at the point where he thinks he's not going to be there for very long. He's still that consummate professional in doing his job. And I think that says a lot about Sisko as well. Just how amazing he is, and he, against his desires, is fitting in really well with this ramshackle Cardassian monstrosity. Because he just has this innate ability to bring it all together. You know, he's the captain dad of Deep Space Nine, and
he is Space Dad.
Yeah, absolutely. He doesn't know it at this early point, but he just slots into that role so perfectly.
Well, and just to kind of sort of put a little bow on what you just said there, and I think that's something that when it comes to community organizing, in our own communities, in our places of work, within our family, there are some places that you're going to have to go that you're not going to want to be, but you're still going to have to show up. Mm-hmm. And he works as a really good analog, a fictional character who can, in fact, express a lot of the frustrations that comes from building power within your community, within the people you live around. And I think we like easy. We don't like difficult. We don't like things, and we don't like that when people, you know, kind of conflict with each other and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, jokingly calling him Space Dad is something important, because I feel very much like, as much as other crews become a family, you know, Deep Space Nine is like the dysfunctional family, quote unquote. And I bulk against the term dysfunctional family, because if people take a Sisko-like role where, you know, I'm not happy to be here, you know, like, this isn't the thing I want to do today. I'd rather do something else. I've got an issue happening. I've got this, that, or the other thing on my mind. But succeeding in life is typically a matter of living up to the things you signed up for. And he signed up to Starfleet to do jobs within Starfleet. And as much as he doesn't want to be out here, I think sometimes the most reluctant leader tends to sometimes be the best, because they aren't there for clout. They aren't there for glory. They aren't there for anything other than to do their job. And as they engage with that role, that job does become something that they love, because they have to find reasons to stay. Mm-hmm. And he does. And he creates those reasons through the relationships he makes. And we as people need to do that in our, like I said, in our places of work, in our families, and in our communities, because it's easy to walk away. It's easy to alienate ourselves. It's easy to just get our phone out and just shut off from everyone else who's around us. It takes courage, and it takes a certain level of dedication, and I guess a self-critical approach, right? I don't think Sisko's happy with himself all of the time. And again, you know, he has that sly turn of phrase, you know, especially with Kira. And Kira, I mean, heck, we could talk at length about her as well. And folks, I'm pretty sure we will.
I look forward to that discussion. Absolutely.
Right? And again, the person who doesn't necessarily not want to be there, but it's not like she's terribly jazzed about Sisko being there. Why aren't Bajorans running this ship, right? Mm-hmm. Why is the Federation kind of muscling its way in? And I've got this commander, who isn't terribly interested in being here. And the fact that he is working with someone who, depending on the perspective, was a terrorist. Now, I mean, we can go on about that until we're blue in the face, but I will save that for the Kira discussion that we have in the future. I think the last piece that I want to stick on in terms of this first sort of salvo on Benjamin Sisko is for his time as well. I think he was a very modern and very new style of character. He is a single father who is not rough and tumble with his boy and all this sort of stuff. He is loving and he is nurturing. He kisses his child on camera, if I remember. He embraces
several
him
times. Yeah.
He takes this loving, caring, nurturing role as a man. And I think that for me is true masculinity. Is a man, whatever you want to call that, however you want to define that, a man should not be determined by how tough he is or anything like that. It's a matter of being reliable, and it's a matter of nurturing those who you have relations with. And that's where true strength is drawn from. That is where true strength comes from. Masculinity is always talked about being strong, but we tend to create this world of sort of physical strength and aggression that makes us strong. And there are points where Sisko is physical and strong and aggressive, right? When he punches Q in the face, I'm not Picard, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But I think he's also, like every man, quite vulnerable. And we are vulnerable. I feel vulnerable sometimes as a male, and sometimes it's difficult to process that vulnerability. And seeing it explored and portrayed by a character who has all of these other cool dimensions to him right off the hob, I think this is what makes him so relatable to people who are sort of exploring what masculinity truly means. And I think that Sisko portrays masculinity in a very healthy way.
Absolutely, yeah. That's been long one of my absolute favorite things about the character, especially when it comes to his relationship with Jake. It's just it was something we never saw, or rarely saw anyway. I'm sure someone can pull up some examples somewhere, but something that I certainly never saw on television before Deep Space Nine was that. And it comes in such unexpected ways sometimes too. Like, I remember watching The Visitor for the first time, and again, we're kind of jumping ahead here, but like, it makes me cry every time I watch it. And the first time I watched that, I had no idea what was happening. Like, I just felt like I got punched in the gut, and it struck such a primal chord in my brain. And it's a father-son thing that I didn't know was in there. Like, the love between two people we see expressed on television is 9 times out of 10 a romantic love or something like that. Like, that's the representation of love, with the other 1 out of 10 times being familial love. The love between a father and a son is like a 0.0 something out of 10 times. Like, it's something that I needed to see, it turned out, and a lot of people, judging by their reactions, needed to see too, and I had no idea. It kicks me in the gut every time, and I love that episode. Yeah,
I think the only other father-son relationship that really gets driven in would be Spock and his father, and that is a story of estrangement and distance.
Which is very common. Very common.
Estrangement and distance is typically the father-son paradigm. If you do see a nurturing father, it's to his daughter, right? And that's that. So again, Jake's father, like, what a lucky boy to have a father like him, and someone who he really can project. And I think anyone who is a father, be it biological, be it step, be it sort of however fatherhood comes into your life, take a page from the book of Sisko, because that kind of love and nurturing aspect will really, quote unquote, pay the bills moving forward with your relationship. You need to be strong in the ways that men tend to project their strength. But if that's all you have, then distance and estrangement is really all you're going to get. Ultimately, it is about being nurturing. It is about being caring and loving and being vulnerable, especially with your son. Like, I think about every time he sees him, it's always, hey, Jake, go, and it's beautiful. It really is. Like, it just warms the cockles of my heart to see him. So I could go on forever about the fatherhood of Ben Sisko, but I think I'll leave it there for now and just put that one out to the listenership. Here's to good dads.
Yeah, well, this might actually be a good time just to mention the generational aspect of that relationship in Deep Space Nine as well, because we do see Sisko interacting with his father, Joseph Sisko, and that relationship there, you can tell, is full of just as much love as the relationship between Ben and Jake. And also the kind of flipping of things, Star Trek explores this a little bit. The son taking care of the dad who won't take the medication that he's supposed to be taking, won't take care of himself the way that his son thinks he should be taking care of himself.
Yeah.
And the frustration there. I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to as well. And I think a lot of people saw themselves and their relationships in that as well. So would have loved to have seen more Joe Sisko on Deep Space Nine. Absolutely. We only get him a handful of times. But what we saw was just so wonderful.
There's no in canon like official jambalaya recipe, is there, of Joe's, or do we have? I've never actually made jambalaya in my life. I don't really have the ingredients at hand, but
not in canon. I know there's a Star Trek cookbook out. I don't know, there are a few actually. I don't know if there's one in there though, but that would be. Yeah.
Be interested in that.
Well, let's keep going forward into Deep Space Nine here then. You know, we've got a couple seasons of Sisko as a commander. Start of season 3, I think, is where you really start to notice. And they write it in. Like the season 3 premiere, The Search Part 1, we have Sisko returning to Deep Space Nine after having been on Earth for a little bit. And he's hanging some, African masks and some art in his quarters. And they have that scene where Jake is saying like, "Oh, I thought you'd never take that out of the home at Earth."
Is it good to be home?
Yeah, I can't wait to sleep in my own bed again.
Phew. I wonder when that happened.
What?
When did I start thinking of this Cardassian monstrosity as home?
They're moving in, right? They're finally after 2 full seasons moving in, really. This is, of course, when we get the Defiant and we get to see Sisko, something else he was kind of denied as a commander of the station. We never got that shot of Sisko in a captain's chair. And now we finally get that. Even though he's not yet a captain, he's got that center seat on a starship. And, you can finally put together those images of the 3 captains in quote marks at this time. I think this character really started to come into his own here with the Dominion threat is kind of looming. Season 3 really marks a turning point for me in Deep Space Nine and in Sisko's character for sure.
A dear friend of mine has always said that once he grows that goatee,
yes,
things just change.
She's about like the last 4 or 5 episodes of season 3.
Yeah. And then I think that change there is important because, you think about Avery Brooks's previous role as Hawk, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of, he wanted the bald head and the goatee immediately, but they didn't want people to be like, oh, there's Hawk. I'm sorry. I actually never knew Hawk existed until years after Deep Space Nine ended.
Me too,
and that's my fault for not really knowing the sort of the cop shows and stuff that a lot of Star Trek actors find themselves in, right? We've got TJ Hooker and whatnot. So, but I think that first of all, there's no mistake when they decide to name Sisko's ship the Defiant, and I think he has been a defiant person throughout. And will continue to be. And their treatment of that ship, I think, very much in a lot of ways mirrors the treatment of Sisko and both in and out of the TV show itself. And to first look at the Defiant, it does seem kind of off-putting. And a lot of people who I know, I have a model of the Defiant in my office, people will typically look at that one and be like, what kind of alien ship is that? And I'm like, well, that's human. And they're like, it looks way different. And I'm like, yep. And they're like, well, which of these ships is your favorite in this line? And I point at the Defiant and they're like, you like that one the best? And I'm like, it has the most character. And I think that's ultimately it is, some people have said that Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, is so ugly he's good looking. I think you can kind of use the same logic to some degree with the Defiant, that it is ugly. But as I think it was Thomas Riker who said, she's a tough little ship. Or maybe it was Will. I can't remember.
Actually, oddly enough, both of them. Thomas Riker says it in the DS9 episode Defiant, and then Will Riker says it in Star Trek First Contact.
Perfect. There we are. Thank you. So I think in this, we do see season 3 kind of resolve a couple of the loose ends that the first few seasons don't resolve. You know, I think we lose a lot of potentially really good actors throughout. I really liked Sisko's interactions with Kaiopaka back in the day, and I wish that could have been carried on a little further, but I do sort of see her sort of mirroring a Guinan-like role that wasn't necessary completely, I guess. At the same time, I am happy that he sort of had that. Ultimately, you know, this is the transitional season, though. In so many ways, we see Deep Space Nine sort of apply the clutch and then shift into a completely new gear. And I have to say, usually when I start my Deep Space Nine rewatches, I have to say I typically start in season 3, or even just into season 4 and just go for it. And then I'm watching to the end, or I'm kind of passively watching to the end. Yeah. Season 3 is really the big one for me.
Yeah, there's some great stuff in that. And like you said, he grows the beard, right? Like they say that's become a trope for when a show gets good, is it grows the beard, you know, Riker, Sisko. But yeah, this season, like I said, it marks that turning point. And then at the very end of the season, in the final episode of season 3, is when Sisko finally gets what he deserves, I think, is this promotion to captain. Like the writers even have characters say,
though I don't fully understand this humanoid obsession with rank and title, if anyone deserves to be promoted, it's you.
Oh, bloody time, bud. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can feel the writers are kind of saying, like, come on, we needed a captain. And Sisko is now finally that captain, which leads us into season 4, which, if season 3 is the turning point, season 4 is the expression of that turning point, where for the first 3 seasons, Deep Space Nine has been this lonely outpost on the frontier. And I put frontier in quote marks because I love that scene, just as a little side thing with Bashir and Kira in the first episode, where this is where heroes were made, out here on the frontier. And Kira's like, this frontier is my home. Like, you may call this the frontier, but you know, this is somewhere for people. And at this point, Deep Space Nine and the Bajor sector becomes somewhere for a lot of people, as you know, this is now a hub of commerce, exploration, and this kind of vanguard, this bulwark against the coming Dominion threat that is looming here. Sisko really steps into that role where over the course of the next few seasons, you know, in this episode, the Klingons cancel the Khitomer Accords. They go to war with the Federation for a bit. Sisko is the one that has Gowron re-sign the Khitomer Accords, standing in the infirmary on Deep Space Nine. Like, he steps up and becomes this political leader as well as a captain in Starfleet and a military leader. He absolutely stands toe to toe with the heads of governments. He deals directly with the leader of the founders. Like, if Picard is the diplomacy captain, Sisko definitely has to give him a run for his money at this point.
I would say very much so. And it's these humble beginnings that you can sort of see seeds get planted, and they really start to bear fruit in season 4 a lot with Sisko. And I think, you know, you brought up a really good point, this concept of the frontier becoming the most important place. And I think in the colonial history of the West, a lot of quote unquote frontiers become hubs, become the most important places. And I think it's an interesting way of playing with that concept by making a person who would have been, you know, the progeny of those who were colonized now in a place where he has to sort of balance that idea of, are we as Starfleet a colonizing force, even militarily or through the alliances that we make? Are we asserting our power over the people who we are working with, or are we working with them? And I think what can kind of give him the best place to go, or the best way to handle it, is the idea that he is this emissary, right? The Bajorans have seen him as someone who they weren't really expecting, you know, to be either, but he has this role, this further, more spiritual role. And again, this is something that Star Trek has danced around before, the concept of spirituality. It really comes into play here, and it comes into play in a way I think is handled well. I think the non-theist or atheistic people I know who are fans of Star Trek can still appreciate this. I like the joke of, are they the prophets or are they the wormhole aliens? You know, it's a kind of a life of pi matter of perspective in a lot of ways. And it doesn't take away from the fact that those beings, be them spiritual or be them corporeal, have chosen Sisko in more ways than one. He was planned. And in that plan, you see, again, Sisko having to rise to a certain occasion, right? Again, being a community leader is one thing. Being a spiritual leader, my goodness, I can't imagine the level of on you have to be for that. And you see him fatigued with that role, with that, again, something that was sort of thrust upon him. And he appreciates that. And you're right. In other cases, he is doing a lot of political things as well. For those of us who aren't necessarily initiated into the faith, this actually kind of reminds me a little bit, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, and maybe I'm drawing my own conclusions here, and I think that's okay. You can take this argument for a grain of salt, but what religious leader in the Abrahamic faith specifically was also a military and political leader, but the Prophet Muhammad of Islam, right? He was thrust into a thing, an illiterate man basically told to read, and he's like, I don't know that. And from there, he also has to become a community leader. He has to deal with sort of the ups and downs of being, laws. He's chased away from his home in Mecca, goes to Medina, has to rebuild himself. I think about what happens to Sisko in Deep Space Nine. He has to be a political leader. He has to negotiate. And this guy was like just some illiterate dude for the first 40 years of his life, and then all of a sudden gets thrust into all of this. And again, there was a Muhammad of history. He actually existed. We know that. Other people talk about him. He has historical evidence to it. So again, if you believe he was actually a prophet, the spiritual duties he has are no different than if you think he was just a really important person in history. And the same treatment can be done with Sisko. And I appreciate that a lot because it allows people to approach Sisko from a number of different angles. And by doing that, I think it builds him more as character even outside of the franchise, and this is why I would say he's probably one of the best characters in television, and it's in season 4 that you see the sparks of that really come into being.
I always appreciate it. I think it's interesting. It's an episode I missed the first time around, so I didn't appreciate this until years later, but like the episode Accession in season 4 is where he finally kind of accepts that role as emissary. And it's not really brought up much early on. Like in the first episode of Deep Space Nine, Opaka says, you are the emissary. And he's kind of like, well, I don't know what that means really. And it's not really brought up again until Vedek Wynn in the season 1 finale starts calling him emissary, and he's like, I don't really like that. And she's like, but you are.
Yeah, you don't have to like it.
Yeah, from Wynn's perspective, she's kind of using it as a cudgel a little bit to be like this false obsequience kind of thing, but it's still there. And then season 4 here, he finally accepts it when the role is taken away from him, and basically the prophets tell him like, no, it's you. The other big thing in this season, and we're going to get into the Dominion War right away, but the other thing kind of before the Dominion War is that I just want to bring up is the thwarting of the coup. This coup by Starfleet, which I don't think gets talked enough about, that Starfleet was going to overthrow the Federation president. This coup led by Sisko's former commanding officer and someone he considers a friend, who idiotically brought Sisko in on it before realizing, oh crap, Sisko's a good person. I'm going to shut him out of this now. Whoops. Spelling his own defeat there. That's such a great two-parter. Homefront and Paradise Lost in season 4.
It really takes the integrity side of Sisko to a very logical place, and it is this idea of he himself will eventually do some things that are wildly questionable, or in fact, I would call them war crimes. But in this respect, you have to see him dimensionally, that his approach to leadership, his approach to his position as a member of Starfleet also comes to the point of he has to stick to these principles that he holds. And even if it means going against a friend, even if it means going against, what he might consider, I guess like I haven't seen that episode in a while, but I do remember him kind of being like, "Oh, come on," you know, to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. I think that's important to discern that this wasn't an easy choice. And of all of the not easy choices that Sisko makes, I would say this is one of the big ones that we really have to kind of see right off the bat. And I say right off the bat because this, like we said, is the new gear that Starfleet has taken. And it does a lot to even criticize itself. Like, it's not like we haven't seen Admirals before. It's not like we haven't seen infiltration into Starfleet before. But I would say, from what I remember, this is probably the most believable of what's happening and how it plays out, and also how it gets thwarted, right? Sometimes it does just take, I think about the Dreyfus affair, right? When the French army, I think, was being like wildly anti-Semitic, and Dreyfus testifies in the case of justice against his own army, against his own nation in a lot of ways, but does the right thing.
And I also love that this particular coup, like, there are changelings on Earth, but Admiral Layton is not a changeling. The people orchestrating this coup are not changelings, they're people. All the changelings had to do was set off a bomb at a conference and sit back and watch as Starfleet tore itself apart, or potentially was about to, right? I love Deep Space Nine. The problem is us. The problem is us. It's not
absolutely
outside parasitic bugs or whatever.
No, exactly. And I think that's something that, again, Deep Space Nine does. It creates a realistic texture.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break there. And when we come back, let's talk about the Dominion War. This episode of Positively Trek is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. A special thank you to our Constitution class supporters, Jim Stoffel, Joyce Mirren, and Paul D. Kinnear. To help out with the podcast, visit patreon.com/positivelytrek, where for a small monthly donation, you can get early access to ad-free episodes, shoutouts, exclusive content, associate producer credits, and more. Thank you so much for listening, and live long and prosper. So, end of season 5. We're going to jump ahead a little bit here. We have this building tension, this rising tension with everything going on, and the Dominion War finally breaks out. We have the open hostilities with the mining of the entrance to the wormhole and the whole basically Federation going and destroying some shipyards, and Deep Space and the Dominion forces coming in and taking over Deep Space Nine. In the lead up to this, we have this captain who is torn between his duty of care to Bajor and his duty as a Starfleet officer. We get that great speech where he and his crew are leaving Deep Space Nine to the Dominion. And in the meantime, he has kind of behind the scenes advised Bajor to sign a non-aggression pact with the Dominion so that they'll be kept out of the fighting. In one of those rare scenes, actually, where Kai Wynn is kind of a reasonable person and is actually coming to Sisko saying, like, what should we do? Is the Federation going to protect Bajor as much as they protect Andor, Vulcan, and Earth? Mm-hmm. And Sisko has to tell her, no. Yeah, no. We're not. You need to cover your butts here. We need to do what we can to protect you. And I think I love that moment of candor where a more political captain or somebody might, offer empty platitudes, and then Bajor becomes rolled over by the next great power that comes in. Sisko puts his pride aside and says, we have to do what we can to protect the people we love here. It's a subtle thing, but I love that.
I think you're onto something, and it's something that, again, I don't know which writer specifically came up with it, but I think there is something to be said about a strategic retreat and the usefulness of a strategic retreat, and understanding that sometimes dying on the hill and living to fight another day are two very different and very important things to know when, right? As an educator, there's always the joke. We always say, do I want to die on that hill? And maybe there are some hills that you have to quote unquote die on. You have to fight to the last for, because that's the right thing to do. But I think having the discernment to know when and when not to is actually super important. And I think by retreating, Sisko wins. He ultimately wins, and he is able, you're right, to kind of shore up the difference to make sure that Bajor isn't just steamrolled by the Dominion, as other places tend to get comparatively. And I think in that he shows his ability to be a good leader, both community-wise, spiritually, and militarily. And by doing that retreat, that consolidation that's able to happen, all of the pieces that bring him back to Deep Space Nine are sort of hinted at in this episode when he leaves, much like the Dominion is hinted at so early on in the series too. And it is this kind of sort of looming threat that I really do think 7 seasons is how you got to handle these sorts of things. Like, imagine if we tried to cram Deep Space Nine into 3 seasons. The series itself, the entire series of Deep Space Nine, is like a very well put together 5-course meal, or 7-course meal, I guess you could say. You're never going to get too full. The pieces come as they come. The time taken is important. It's very good storytelling. And I think this aspect of it makes you really feel like, man, like this could have been like a World War II moment, or something maybe more conventional in our own history. But by putting it in this like niche science fiction story is a gift to us. And I think we as Star Trek fans must give credit to the fact that we have these really complicated and dynamic situations where, much like I think, to some degree, I mean, treated much more quickly, The Empire Strikes Back does a good job of, right? The bad guys win in Empire Strikes Back. Like, you just got to look at the way, like, Luke's one hand less. They've lost their last major base. They've basically been pushed to the edge of the galaxy. The rebels have. It ends on a pretty dark note. Han Solo's been kidnapped and put in carbonite. Some existential estranged father issues are showing up. All of these aspects are right in front of us. And so drawing those parallels, yeah, I mean, what's Sisko to do? And I mean, to feel really defeated in that moment, man, you just want to flip the table and be done with it. He doesn't, right? He finds his hope. He moves on. He consolidates and will eventually return. And I love that.
As a little side note here to the listeners, we are recording this on May the 4th. So May the 4th be with you. Kind of fun. We got a little bit of Star Wars content in there too.
Well, there you go. Unintentional, but I'll take it.
I love it. But yeah, this whole aspect and showing the strength of Sisko's leadership, I think, is one of the things that comes out of this. And interestingly, at the start of season 6, we have this extended arc where they're away from the station and we see our characters in situations that are kind of new to them. For Sisko, he kind of, for a little while, becomes an attaché to Admiral Ross, an assistant to the Admiral. Mm-hmm. And instead of commanding the Defiant on these missions, is sending the ship out with Dax in command. And in one particular episode, I love they made this choice. I remember at the time, the message boards on the internet being like, we didn't get to see anything, blah, blah, blah. But in this episode, Sisko is stationed on Starbase 375 and Dax is in command of the Defiant. They send the Defiant on this mission behind enemy lines to destroy some base or some depot or something. And all we see of the Defiant in that episode is Sisko looking out a window and seeing it fly away. And then it returning at the end and Dax celebrating this great victory with her crew. We never see exactly what happens. I mean, like I said, I remember people being, and I'm like, that's brilliant. We see it from Sisko's perspective. He's not part of that anymore. He's the one calling the shots. He put together the mission, but he didn't get to carry it out. That was for someone else to do. And this is the moment that I think, so Sisko takes command of the Defiant again, leads the fleet to take back Deep Space Nine. I think at this moment, this is where Sisko should have been promoted to Admiral, and we could get a continuation of that storyline. Like, can you imagine the story? And I hate criticisms of TV shows that are like, they should have done this. But bear with me here. I love can you imagine Sisko as an admiral being stationed on Deep Space Nine, the station itself under the command of Major Kira? And Sisko is no longer involved in those day-to-day operations of the station. He's doing the big political stuff, the war planning stuff, all of that. Kira's in command of the station. Worf is the highest ranked Starfleet member on the station. Like, I can picture these scenes where Worf is going to Sisko complaining about some decision Kira's made, and Sisko's like, she's your commanding officer. You need to make this work. This is not my job now. And continuing to deal with that, sending others out to do the job, the posting the casualty lists. We kind of got a little bit of that, but we still have Sisko on the front lines leading those troops. Can you imagine him being behind a desk and not allowed to leave to lead those troops? I feel like it would have been a really interesting dynamic.
It would have been a very interesting dynamic. I can kind of see in story why they didn't do that, but then also, we don't want him outranking Picard and Janeway and all that nonsense on the outside of it. But at the same time, he sort of gets there's a Napoleon factor, and that's the only way I can put it, right? There was a lot of cases in a lot of the battles where Napoleon was actually doing a lot of the fighting. He was up in the front. And I think humanizing him, and again, going back to the religious figure of Muhammad was in the battle, right? There's known to be this one battle called the Battle of Badr that they sort of stumbled upon an army and were like, oh, guess we got to fight now. and he's right there with everyone else. And I think it gives him that certain level of clout, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think this is perhaps some of the in-story reasoning behind why Sisko is kept a captain. It gives him that he's still a part of the day-to-day, and maybe being an admiral might have taken him away from some of the stories that we get. But I think, just kind of leading us into the next bit, I think it would have been handled exactly the same if we think about the episode In the Pale Moonlight. If he was an admiral, he might have actually been able to get away with what was an assassination, a terrible assassination, meant to bring an entire nation into a war that they were reluctant to join, but ultimately their joining really does help turn the tide.
That kind of makes the point that I was about to say next too, which is they kind of have their cake and eat it too a little bit, because Sisko does act as an admiral in a lot of cases, In the Pale Moonlight being a prime example, in a lot of the fleet type episodes where Sisko is very obviously coordinating the Starfleet Klingon forces. Like he seems to be taking the role of an admiral, and I think the writers at times kind of were like, well, let's just have him do the things an admiral would do anyway, and also the stuff the captain would do. So but yeah, In the Pale Moonlight, a prime example of, I think, probably something they had in their back of their mind with Sisko having more responsibility.
No, it's good. It's a very, I like your side tangent, and I mean, philosophically, I completely agree with you. And then also in terms of some of the politics that the studio would have been going with the writers and everything else. Again, it really does tie into what exactly we're handling culturally with a black leader. And I like the idea of Worf being the next highest ranking officer. So you have a black man at the top. The next is a non-white woman. I mean, the Bajorans do kind of take on the Jews of the Holocaust sort of feel in a lot of ways, right? And Bajorans definitely face their own Holocaust in a lot of ways. And so for her to be, an outsider religion and all that sort of stuff, and very spiritual, a woman who is very steadfast and very strong in her own right, and then you have another black man in the leadership role, that's perfect to me. I think that's a really good way of being true to the morals of Star Trek in a lot of ways. And it's not that, we don't see color. It's no, actually we do. And this is why these people, these non-white people, these non-men are in power. And I think power is a really important thing to understand. Sisko, in a lot of cases, and I think maybe this is an important piece, why I justify In the Pale Moonlight ultimately, is he is not seeking influence when he is trying to get the Romulans to join. He seeks power. And I think sometimes you're not going to influence the Romulans. There's no influencing the Romulans. They are too nuanced. Their approaches are too sophisticated. You have to trick them. And and I mean, I hate to put it that way, and maybe I'm justifying a really awful crime ultimately, but I can live with that.
Because I can live with it. I can live with it.
Yeah, there's a lot to say on In the Pale Moonlight. I feel like we could do an episode about that episode itself. But one quick thing I wanted to bring up, just because you mentioned this earlier with regards to Admiral Layton and the Starfleet coup, I just want to, typical for me, I want to do a little shout out to a novel, Hollow Men by Una McCormack. She draws this great line between these two events in that novel. It takes place after the whole thing within the Pale Moonlight. Sisko and Garak are on Earth to attend a Starfleet briefing conference thing. During that novel, Sisko leaves to go visit Admiral Layton in prison to basically say, like, what do? I've done this thing. I've done the thing that you did.
Yeah.
And get advice from his former commanding officer who tried to, overthrow Starfleet.
Yeah.
Is amazing. I love that.
And I think Garak's monologue there, where he's basically been thrown around by Sisko in his tailor shop.
And if your conscience is bothering you, you should soothe it with the knowledge that you may have just saved the entire Alpha Quadrant, and all it cost was the life of one Romulan senator, one criminal, and the self-respect of one Starfleet officer. I don't know about you, but I'd call that a bargain.
I'm sorry, but is this about you? Right? Has your pride been damaged? Has your sense of integrity been damaged? Or, I guess it does bring up this concept of, like, all is fair in love and war. One of my favorite movies of all time is The Battle of Algiers. And it's about the FLN, the Algerian people who liberate themselves from French colonization. And there's a moment at the beginning or near the beginning of the movie where the main character is approached by one of his friends, and his friend is like, I'm not joining the FLN, I'm going to tell on you guys. And he just whips out a machine gun and guns his friend down and looks at the other guys, and they just book it. They're like, oh, I'm out of here. And you're like, wow, this guy is heartless and he's terrible and all this sort of stuff. But it is something like, you think about the life in the Kasbahs, the Arabic towns in Algeria, and how they were treated by the French. The life that he took would have probably been taken by the French anyway. And I hate to do it that way. I hate to say it that way, but, like, I'm sorry, but there's a point where you have to shape up or ship out, right? And the lines get very, very clearly drawn, right? The ambassador, or whomever he was, the Romulan, was not going to play ball. He could have played ball and survived, but he decided not to, so he had to die. And yeah, one casualty in this negotiation and one person's self-respect might actually be worth it. And again, I also have to go on to the other side and say that, if it's for the interests of a colonial or an occupying power or the evil, typically you see bad guys doing stuff like this. I think this is a really good way to kind of have to swallow a jagged pill. I will say, though, his obsession with what's his face? Oh, why am I suddenly forgetting his name? Eddington. Yeah. I do have to say one thing, though, and his obsession with Eddington does make him commit a full-on war crime. One where I think, had he not have been taken by the prophets, Sisko should have probably faced consequences for the destruction of that the atmosphere of that one planet where there were colonists on it. And he made it perfect for the Cardassians to live on, though. So they get that little techno babble out, right? That makes it all okay. Sure. But I guess that really does. I would say that moment, and even Worf is like, "Are you sure, buddy? Like, is this what you want to do? Like, I'm a warrior. I'm a born again Klingon. I'll do anything, Melota, kind of thing." But in this respect, even Worf is like, "Okay, I guess I have to follow the orders." And honestly, I wouldn't have blamed Worf to say, Captain, if I will actually just resign right here, right now. I won't do this. Nope, not going to happen. But he doesn't, and that's okay too, because it's all a TV show, and it's meant to give us pause. It's meant to make us have to see this character in all of his goods and his bads, right? Sisko has never been a character that's looking for your sympathy or your love. He is defiant. He is irreverent, and he's going to do it his way. So kind of moving towards a wrap up here, we've got the end of the series and the ultimate culmination of Sisko's emissary storyline, which to my mind
detrimentally a little bit gets wrapped up in the end of the Dominion War storyline. I would have liked those to have been a little bit separate, but that's a discussion for another day. One thing we haven't talked about is Sisko and Dukat, these kind of flip sides of this coin that come to kind of a head here. Right from episode 1, right? We've got Sisko in Dukat's office. This used to be my office, and all of that. And then right up to the end, we've got Sisko as kind of the emissary of the prophets, and Dukat basically as the emissary of the pah-wraiths, and this kind of celestial battle taking place. Sisko, of course, sacrificing himself to save the people of Bajor. Some very messianic themes in there, of course, with this idea that he will one day return.
Yeah.
Which is like a little on the nose, but Deep Space Nine was kind of on the nose about that sort of stuff, right? Too. So what are your thoughts on let's do this in 5 minutes, the role of religion in Star Trek and Sisko's position as a mythological figure?
Well, I think I've already kind of touched on that by making him as closely analogized to the Prophet Muhammad, right? In a lot of ways. But we do get into some more messianic aspects of him. And I think this is again where the Abrahamic faiths fit really well with the Bajoran faith as it is. And the Bajoran faith, I think its closest analog would have to be Judaism. What the Cardassians do to the Bajorans, given the time frame at which this story is being told in the late 90s. Obviously there are some nods to the Holocaust in a lot of ways. There were Jewish freedom fighters who fought extremely hard and extremely well the entire time. The Jews did not lay down and die or just quietly get rounded up. I have done research on the Bialystok uprising, for instance, in modern-day Belarusia, where Jewish freedom fighters handed the Nazis their asses. And I mean that in the most honorable way. They fought hard and they fought well. And a lot of them died fighting. And I mean, it sucks that they had to die at all, but the fact that a lot of them did not die on their knees. And there were, in fact, sabotages that took place within concentration camps and all of that sort of stuff as well. Stuff that we don't really talk about. We do kind of sort of look at it more as this kind of, they just got rounded up and killed. No, they fought hard, and they were called terrorists at the time. They were called, insurrectionists and all this sort of nonsense that when they were actually heroes. So I think looking at that as a religious figure now, taking that a step further to Sisko, what is this, my understanding of Judaism is the idea that they pray for the arrival of the Messiah every day. And ultimately, it's the fact that the Messiah is always in the state of coming to us, coming into being, right? The Messiah is always arriving in sort of a metaphysical kind of way. And the actual arrival of the Messiah isn't what it's about. It's the friends you make along the way kind of journey better than the destination kind of understanding. And again, I'm not Jewish. I don't have the full knowledge there, but that's kind of the impression I get from the Jewish friends that I have and know and keep in very close touch with. I think also, though, you can sort of take a step back and not have any connection to any of the Abrahamic faiths and still appreciate the religiosity that gets explored by Sisko. He is his own character. He isn't Jesus. He isn't Muhammad. He isn't the coming Messiah, and the wormhole aliens might be what they are. So I do also like the fact that you can take all of this and its quote unquote, in canon historicity and still see it scientifically and atheistically, but it gives you the option to see it that way, even if you might not yourself be religious. And I think that's the best, most accessible. You can chew on it the most easily and get the most out of it.
And I love that that's paralleled in world and out of world too,
right?
Because Sisko and the Bajorans are surrounded by people who, like, Sisko's surrounded by people who are on one side or the other, where, like, you're the emissary, they're the prophets. Kira is in this really fascinating position of being really good friends with the emissary, but also seeing him as the emissary, as the spiritual person who's going to guide her people out of the darkness. And he does so, right?
And he disappoints her sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because he's a human being.
Yep.
And I mean human being in the terms of sapient person,
yes.
not species within Star Trek. But this brings me to the idea, and we've talked a little bit about this on previous episodes, but this idea of this mythology, this creating of mythology, and 800 years is a long time. Star Trek now exists at a point 800 years past the end of Deep Space Nine. How cool would it be to see a Bajoran character whose mythology is made up of characters we've seen in quote unquote real life on television? You know, Sisko, the emissary, the one who's promised to return, whether he did return or not, or in the eyes of some returned, or in the eyes of others did not return. That wasn't really Sisko. That wasn't really the emissary. That was, you know, whatever. Mm-hmm. How cool would it be? Like, for example, the upcoming Starfleet Academy series, to have a Bajoran cadet who has, you know, some holy scripture that talks about Sisko and his followers, Kira, Worf, Dax. Like, yeah. That would be so fascinating to see that. 800 years, like I say, that's a long time. Yeah. Definitely more than enough time for this mythology to have been built up, and for it to be both in this context of a mythology, but also to be true. We saw it. We saw it happen, you know?
Well, again, I can't walk away from the analogy, but there's, you know, in Islam, there's the Quran, but there's also the Hadith. And the Hadith is the day-to-day life of Muhammad and his companions, or the Acts of the Apostles with Jesus, right? And that's the point is we can get these analogs that can take us into some really interesting territory that, you know, as a Western society, we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that, you know, like Canada very much bases itself on the tenets of Christianity. And a lot of people like Star Trek. I know a lot of Muslims who like Star Trek. I know a lot of Jewish people who like Star Trek.
I know a lot of atheists who like Star Trek.
Exactly. And from there, we can also see how we can all coexist and all take from this story what we as individuals and groups need and want. And we can also appreciate how other people are able to take from this what they want and need. It is something that can unify us and bring us together and give us a better perspective as to how we should relate to each other as believers, non-believers, somewhere in betweeners, and really appreciate the story, because again, we've said this, Star Trek isn't space. They're not traveling through space. They're exploring the human condition. Someone like Sisko, someone who is of a marginalized background, a person who is reluctant and defiant and irreverent, but also is wildly important because of all of those things. Sisko is a character you simply can't ignore. And you're right, we haven't even touched on his relationship, his sort of binary relationship with Dukat, both in a political and then eventually also religious sense. I think that would be an important conversation we could have in sort of a Sisko supplemental to bring a little more things full circle.
Or a Dukat episode, which I would be really interested in doing.
Maybe we just do that, actually. I think a Dukat episode will do the things we need to do. One thing I just want to mention in closing, and this is my favorite episode of Star Trek, and I've said this on this show, and I think I've said it on Politics in the past, and pretty much any other podcast I've been on, I always try to bring this up, that Far Beyond the Stars is my favorite episode of Star Trek, hands down, beyond the shadow of any doubt. It doesn't take place on a Starfleet ship, and doesn't even deal with a lot of the things that are happening in the Dominion arc at the time. But I think to really and truly tackle racism and white supremacy and how it's baked into culture, and how even hundreds of years after it's quote unquote resolved, it can still have lasting impacts, right? Slavery lasted for hundreds of years, for centuries. And so for a few centuries later, for it still to be an issue is not only not surprising, but I'm thankful that it is, that we are still reckoning with those sorts of things. A lot of people say, you know, oh, it happened this long ago, get over it. Well, all I have to say is Remembrance Day. Right?
Yeah.
A bunch of soldiers died in the trenches 100 and some odd years ago. Get over it. No, we don't, and we won't. That's not what we do. We commemorate that. We remember those people. We remember the soldiers. We remember the nurses. We remember the civilians who were thrust into that. In the sake of we never want it to happen again, and to remind ourselves of that in a meaningful way through ceremony, through, you know, there is a religiosity to it. There's also an atheistic element to it. There's a societal commemoration that takes place, but also understanding that that kind of trauma shapes you as a society. It shapes you, and it's important to reckon with it. And so I think that that was the most bold episode of Star Trek. And knowing again, and I've said this before, that where Benny is shouting that it was real, all that sort of stuff, that was the second take. Rene Auberjonois said, he's like, Avery does this amazing thing. Everyone's practically in tears watching him. And then the camera guy swallows hard and goes, I wasn't filming that. And they're like, what the bleep? But Avery Brooks just picks it back up. He steels himself and goes into it.
Oh, amazing.
With the goatee especially, there is another little piece politically that I want to talk about, and that's Malcolm X. And I think that Avery Brooks does add a fair bit of Malcolm X to Sisko's character, especially in the last couple of seasons. And I really appreciate that. And I would encourage people to look into Malcolm X's story. Again, born in Omaha, Nebraska, middle of nowhere, pretty simple beginnings, one of the only black people living in that city at the time, and then ultimately rising to be one of the most polarizing but also militant members of the African-American struggle in so many ways. And they try to blame it on the religion of why he was killed, but it wasn't. He was killed by the state. Of course he was. And they made it so that he was killed by people of his own racial background, but let's face it, we know how that panned out. And, you know, thinking of Sisko, I wonder to some degree if he was becoming a bit of a nuisance to Starfleet as well. He was becoming a little too big for his britches and was really taking on a big leadership role. And again, maybe that's why they didn't make him an admiral, because I think he could have really done a lot of change for Starfleet.
I saw a really good analysis. I think it was a Reddit thread talking, and somebody said something along those lines, like, in universe they can justify it by saying, like, oh, he's the emissary of Bajor. Like, what does that mean for the Prime Directive? Like, right? Okay, this is a political position. It's not just naval rank. It's there's politics. And
what's the pension like if you're an emissary?
Yeah. And maybe that is a big reason why he's not an admiral. I mean, in real life we know why, but in universe, yeah. I mean, we saw that. We saw Starfleet kind of bristling at some of the stuff that he did and said, right? Well, for me, I listened to a podcast called The Incomparable, and it's a really great podcast. Every once in a while, they do something that's called a draft, where people bring out, it's like, oh, best 90s album, and people have their lists, and they go around again. And then at the end, they do what they call a Bring Out Your Dead round, which is like anything that didn't get in the first few rounds gets mentioned here. I like that better than lightning round. So my Bring Out Your Dead round is just a kind of quick scattershot bunch of stuff that we didn't talk about that I think needs to be at least mentioned with Sisko. His relationship with Cassidy Yates, I think that's an important one. A surrogate mother for Jake coming in, and what that relationship looks like for a man and his grown son, and a new relationship, not replacing his previous one, but a new relationship. And I thought that was really fascinating. His mentorship and faith in Nog, I think, is a huge thing, which kind of ties into the next little bit, which is his evolving attitude towards the Ferengi. Yeah. He's not a perfect character. At the beginning, we get some great, like in season 2, the episode The Jem'Hadar, there's a great conversation between Quark and Sisko.
Yes. Because you disapprove of Ferengi values, you scorn us, distrust us, insult us every chance you get.
Quark, I don't have to stand there and defend myself.
Tell me, Commander, would you allow your son to marry a Ferengi female?
I never thought about it.
Exactly my point.
Not happy that Quark is showing this highly evolved human to have some blind spots and stuff. Great stuff that Deep Space Nine was willing to tackle, and that their lead character was willing to have these blemishes that get worked through. He becomes he loves the Ferengi, but you know, he knows them for what they are. You know how to deal with Ferengi, but he doesn't have this immediate like, ugh, Ferengi, like he very obviously does at the beginning, right? So Benjamin Sisko, there's so much more we could talk about.
He's a dynamic and challenging character, and a breath of fresh air in the Star Trek universe in so many ways.
Absolutely. And I know there's a bunch of stuff we've left on the table, and I'm sure our listeners will let us know.
Please do.
Please do. Let us know your favorite aspects of Sisko. What didn't we mention? Do you agree horribly disagree with anything we've said here, we want to hear it all. We love this kind of feedback. So reach out to us, positivelytrek@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media at Positively Trek, pretty much everywhere. And the Positively Trek discussion group on Facebook. That's the best place to get in touch with us and kind of have this conversation. So we look forward to hearing from you. I've been Dan Gunther, and this has been Positively Trek. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate and love each and every one of you. We won't disappear into the Celestial Temple. We will be back next week. So until then, live long and prosper and stay positive. Positively Trek is produced and edited by me, Dan Gunther, and co-produced by Barry DeFord on Treaty 8 territory, the home of the Beaver, Cree, Dene, and Métis people, whose histories, languages, and cultures we respect. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations.